Hey guys, welcome back. So before we get started, if I sound a little different, I'm trying out a new microphone. If it sounds good, let me know. If it doesn't, I can go back to the old one. But anyways, for today's topic, I'm not going to be discussing any particular champion or group, nor will it be based on a mechanic or game element. Instead, I want to make a video discussing the League community, particularly its mindset towards players who deviate away from what is considered conventional. In League of Legends, there is a strong sense of conformity. Players are expected to take X champions to Y role and build Z items. Ever since the game reached mainstream consciousness, which I believe was around the start of Season 3, everyone colloquially agreed to follow a bunch of unspoken rules, which ultimately created what we now know as the meta. Most of the time, any attempts to go against the tide would be quickly discarded as just another idiot thinking they discovered the next OP clickbait for Professor Akali to milk like no tomorrow. But every now and then, an individual would be both ambitious and psychotic enough to diverge from the status quo and actually find success, climbing high enough to compete with the best of the best in their respective regions. Whenever this does happen, the responses come in a mixed bag. Some people might argue these cases are proof that you can play basically whoever you want, however you want, and still reach the likes of Masters, Grandmasters, or even Challenger. On the flip side, there's an equal number of responses moaning and groaning about how everyone should avoid ranked for the next few days because everyone's gonna start following this player and hard hinting games. The number might be small relative to the entire community size, but these moments occur very frequently, so much so that my good friend Happy Chime Noises has a channel dedicated to covering off-meta players who are able to perform such feats. So I thought I'd spend some time talking about off-meta strategies. Are they creative and possibly beneficial for the game? Or is playing off-meta tantamount to trolling and should be considered a punishable offense? Let's get started. Just like every other discussion topic, we need to set the stage first. What is meta? The metagame is an approach to a game that transcends or operates outside of the prescribed rules of the game. Hence why at the beginning I said unspoken rules. Nothing in League of Legends ordains what champions should be played in what role or which champions are the best right now. We as the player base sort of collectively decide on how things should be done. It creates a sense of structure and order within the game itself. Basically, metagame literally translates to the game within the game. It's also a backronym for the most efficient or most effective tactic available, which explains itself. The meta shifts all the time in League of Legends thanks to the bi-weekly patches we get with the slew of balance changes, buffing and nerfing champions and items as well as introducing new ones. However, the easiest way to determine if something is meta is by looking at statistics. Do they have a high win rate, pick rate, and ban rate? These three metrics may not always be conducive to a meta champion, but they serve as an adequate indicator. For example, at the time of making this video, Camille has over a 51% win rate in top lane, with about a 15% pick rate and ban rate. Typically, a champion's win rate is inversely proportional to its pick rate, since the more frequently a champion is played, the more chances they have of losing games as they do winning. So when you see someone with an abnormally high win rate along with a substantial pick rate and ban rate, it's safe to say they're considered a meta pick. The champions themselves don't make up the meta though, so do the way they're played and how they're built. Right now, Kha'Zix finds lasting employment in the jungle and bot lane, whereas a long time ago he spent most of his time mid. Dr. Mundo used to be exclusively a top laner, but Riot has been making attempts to push him into the jungle. As for builds, Ezreal probably had more meta builds over the years than just about anyone else. From Runeglaive to Double Tier to Blue Build to Duskblade and now Divine Sunder. And that's barely a fraction of how much has changed for him despite being pretty much the same as he's always been since he came out. Depending on how they evolve and how the game evolves with them, their roles and builds can change. So then if the meta is constantly changing, what is off-meta? Off-meta is fundamentally a strategy that is utilized very infrequently, one that deviates from the standard usage of that strategy. There's a pretty wide range when it comes to this. You can make a case for AP Twitch or Lucian Mid being off-meta picks, as they're not something you see most of the time even though everyone is aware of their viability. What most people think of as off-meta would be if a champion is going a completely different role and build, which is the stuff Chimes covers. You got Wukong Support, Tank Kha'Zix Mid, Crit Aatrox Jungle, Qiyana AD carry, things like that. Admittedly, off-meta picks can be pretty fun to watch. One of my favorite YouTubers is The Boss. I can't pronounce your name, but it's fine, we're showing. This guy is known for his super crazy science shenanigans, and if you watch any of his videos, you'll be smiling the entire time. But I'm willing to bet money, if you ran into any of these off-meta picks in Chance Select, you're not going to be very happy. But doesn't that make you wonder, why is that? Why does seeing off-meta picks feel like such a terrible thing in League of Legends? Why is it that when we see Janna top or Sejuani mid, that's considered a bad thing? While not an unreasonable or irrational response towards those kinds of picks, it does raise some serious questions as to why the community, myself included, is so averse to seeing off-meta picks, and the notion that whoever goes these types of picks are trolls or inters, when assuming we give them the benefit of the doubt, they very well may be onto something. After all, there were quite a few instances where off-meta picks eventually became the meta. Anyone remember Ezreal Jungle or Pantheon Support? Those started off as off-meta picks until people quickly caught on to how broken they were. I suppose the way we can go about this is to discuss the pros and cons of off-meta picks. I came up with a list myself and cross-reference it with chimes to figure out whether the good outweighs the bad. We're going to start first with the pros and cover the cons second. Arguably, the best part of off-meta picks is that no one knows how to play against you. Even though meta picks are very strong like Diana Jungle or Ziggs Bot, after playing against them for like a dozen games you eventually figure out ways to play around them, how to approach them in the neutral, how to handle them in teamfights, and where their strengths and weaknesses are. At first, it may seem like a matchup nightmare, but eventually all that experience can be utilized. Could you say the same thing if you were suddenly pitted against a Heimerdinger support or a Nasus mid? It's likely that's the first time you've ever played that matchup before, which can work in the off-meta player's favor, as there's no prior empirical data to work off of. Even if you know what that champion's abilities do, you still don't know all the interactions, numbers, and power spikes relative to what you play and especially what time. You might have an idea on how to stop Lilia jungle as Zed mid, but that's after you're both out of the laning phase and have a few items. What happens if you go up against a Lilia in the mid lane? Do you know if you can beat her pre-6 without your mythic? You're not sure, right? There's a huge element of surprise for off-meta picks, which can be used to your advantage to cheese a lot of wins. This is especially true in solo queue, where players have far too little respect for their opponent and often overestimate their own abilities. Much of the reason why these off-meta players reach such high elo is because they capitalize on the fact that no one has ever fought against a Qiyana ADC or Aphelios top. It's a whole new ballgame, and these players tend to have complete mastery over their own champions, like minimum half a thousand games. Their opponent, on the other hand, might be playing first-time Viego just because he's a meta champion. Thing is, even for players who understand their lack of experience in this situation, that in a way can also work to an off-meta player's advantage. If you're up against an unfamiliar lane opponent with a radically different build than they usually do, you might play a bit safer because you don't want to take unnecessary risks and accidentally get them fed. But perhaps they're actually really weak in the early game, so you should be aggressive, meaning you fell for their mind game and ended up losing the one chance you had of shutting them down. In a strategy game like League of Legends, knowledge is half the battle. With no knowledge, you start off at a massive disadvantage. Next reason is that some off-meta picks may actually be the solution to countering meta, and not just a quirky tactic the player decides to pick up. One of the reasons Pyke mid became such a problem is because a lot of champions in the mid lane have no mobility, since they're home to the majority of mages, well known for the lack of escapes. Also, since it's a solo lane, they have no support to peel for them, making them an easy target for Pyke since he's got enough damage and pressure to beat them head on. And let's of course not forget his amazing roaming potential thanks to his stealth and fast tempo. Another example would be Warwick top, which we started seeing pop up occasionally ever since Season 10. This guy does a fantastic job shutting down skirmishers and divers since he can sustain super well, has a lot of stick potential, and ridiculous damage. At the moment, Camille and Wukong are both really difficult top laners to deal with since they have a strong laning phase and scale really well, but Warwick destroys both of them with relative ease. In each of Chimes' videos, he explains the thought process and methodology behind off-meta picks. In his Taric top video, he explained how most melee champions in the early game, even lane bullies like Renekton and Darius, don't have the damage to outduel him because he can spam Q heal over and over again, which also gives him fast attack speed and on-hit damage. These off-meta strategies may seem like random troll picks someone got from Ultimate Bravery, but they're all intentional because they're usually good at countering whatever is meta almost as if they were anti-carries. So those were the two key reasons I could think of why off-meta picks can actually be practical in some cases. Now let's take a look at the reasons as to why it's a bad thing. While it may sound deviously satisfying that no one on the enemy team has any idea of how to play against you, there's very much the possibility, or frankly certainty, that no one on your own team has any idea of how to play around you as well. The words burn my tongue every time I say this, but League of Legends is a team game and requires the collective efforts of all 5 players to achieve victory. Off-meta picks and/or builds subvert expectations and understanding of that champion's capabilities, which can inadvertently lead to situations where fights would have been won if either a normal or meta champion was played in that role, or if the champion went the standard build, such as tank Kha'Zix instead of going regular assassin. You yourself as the off-meta player may be aware of the potential impact you can have on a game, your power spikes, or what you're supposed to do in fights. But with no way to quickly and clearly communicate that to your team, it doesn't even matter, which is all the more reason why I still can't believe voice comms haven't been implemented in League. It's much easier to verbally explain to your team why AP Sejuani Mid has the best gank setup in existence, because if you had to do it through text, you had to stand still to type, and also no one really reads chat anyway. So in a way, you take a huge risk every time you go off meta because you have to essentially hope that the enemy team is more unprepared for dealing with you than your own team is unprepared for playing with you. The second issue is that due to the hyper-specific nature of off-meta strategies, they can potentially have strict win conditions and game plans in order to match those meta champions. If you recall my specialist video, I talked about how the reason several of them have really low pick rates is due to having unique mechanics and gameplay, which can only work in the most ideal circumstances. Off-meta takes this even further. Obviously, Teemo Jungle has terrible clear speed and pretty lackluster ganks, so he has to conduct himself in a very specific way in order to stay relevant in the early game. Aphelios top is basically a worse version of any other ranged top because he has no escapes, inconsistent pressure due to his different weapons, and below average DPS. He does have Severum and Gravitum for sustain and roots, but he won't always have them available. More often than not, he's going to have to surrender lane priority against the majority of divers and slayers up top, as they can gap close and burst him down quickly since he has no support. Remember, things are meta because they are effective in as many circumstances as humanly possible. Being off meta inherently means you aren't efficient in a lot of situations. Xin Zhao was meta for the past couple months because he had good sustain, strong skirmishing, decent ganks, and surprisingly high durability, making him useful in many situations. On the other hand, Teemo Jungle is not going to check off the same boxes as him. It's kind of a paradoxical thing that off-meta is seen as creative, yet their champions can't really wear a whole bunch of hats. So normally I would have a bias towards one point or the other. For the healing video, I sided against it. For solo queue versus pro play, I was in favor of solo queue. For the one-tricks video, I was supportive of one-tricking up to a certain point. But for the off-meta, I really don't know. Me personally, I'm one of those players who only finds League fun when I win, which naturally makes me inclined to say follow the meta since meta has the highest chance of winning. Or so we think. But I can't in good conscience say that off-meta is a bad thing either because again, we have examples of them actually working. Yes, I understand these are 1 in a million, and if the average player tried these strategies themselves, they'd play worse than my cat if I had one. But that doesn't mean it's not possible, and there have been quite a few games I've played where Zilean AD carried turbo diffed the game or Zed Jungle was sleeper OP and solo carried. I think it's a case of the proverb, a weapon is only as good as its wielder, and it sort of ties in with the message I conveyed in the One Tricks video, where it's better to play a champion you know like the back of your hand than to first time Irelia just because she's OP right now. Of course, it's a case-by-case basis. Just because Soraka mid worked that one time doesn't mean it works every time. It might have just been a lucky game. One thing I do think needs to be addressed is Riot's somewhat unwillingness to accept off-meta themselves. Every time we see an off-meta strategy become popular, it gets nerfed into the ground. That in and of itself is a point of contention too. If a champion is good enough to be effective in multiple roles, that could be too powerful of a pick in pro play, because for instance you can flex top jungle or mid Lee Sin or top mid support Lulu. That's a little overpowered, not gonna lie. And even if they were willing to allow these champions to have working off-meta strategies, there is a massive social stigma due to those strategies failing more than they succeed. Anyways, I think that's about it for today. If you enjoyed the video, it would be awesome if you can leave a like, consider subbing to the channel for more content like this, follow me on my socials and join my Discord server if you haven't yet, and don't forget to check out my previous discussion topics as well. But for now, thanks so much for watching and I'll see you again soon for the next video. Take care.